Michael had just finished preparing dinner when he noticed something was off with Emily. She had been unusually quiet all evening, picking at her food and excusing herself early to go upstairs. At first, he thought it was just a typical mood swing. After all, Emily was 10 years old, navigating the awkward period of pre-adolescence. But when he went upstairs to check on her, he found her sitting on the edge of her bed, pale and clutching her chest, her breaths coming in short, wheezing gasps. "Emily, what's wrong?" Michael asked, rushing to her side. I can't breathe," she managed to rasp before her eyes widened in fear and her body slumped forward slightly. Panic surged through Michael's veins. He gently helped her lie down and grabbed his phone, immediately dialing 911. The operator answered quickly, her calm and composed voice a stark contrast to the chaos Michael felt brewing inside. He explained Emily's symptoms as clearly as he could, stumbling over his words but making sure to emphasize the urgency. The operator assured him that an ambulance was on its way and instructed him to stay calm and keep Emily propped up to help her breathe until the paramedics arrived. Michael thanked the operator and hung up, his heart pounding. He glanced at Emily, who was still struggling to catch her breath. Her face was tinged with a faint bluish hue, and her eyes fluttered open briefly before closing again. He felt helpless, but knew he couldn't let his emotions get the better of him. Racing down the stairs, Michael opened the front door to prepare for the ambulance's arrival. He wanted to ensure they had a clear path to the house, knowing that every second could be critical. His driveway was the most direct and spacious way for an ambulance to park and access the house without delay. To his horror, as he stepped outside, he saw a large black SUV parked squarely in the middle of his driveway. The vehicle was unfamiliar. It wasn't one of the neighbor's regular cars. Its sleek, polished surface gleamed under the streetlights, a stark contrast to the chaotic urgency brewing in Michael's mind. He stared at the vehicle in disbelief for a moment, hoping he was imagining things. "But are you kidding me right now?" he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration and panic. Michael scanned the neighborhood, his eyes darting from one house to another. Most of the nearby homes had their lights off. It was late in the evening, and many neighbors had likely settled in for the night. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted movement. On the sidewalk across the street, his neighbor Karen was strolling leisurely with her small, fluffy dog. Karen was infamous in the neighborhood for her entitlement and constant meddling in other people's affairs. Michael had had a few minor run-ins with her in the past, mostly over trivial matters like where he placed his garbage bins or how often he mowed his lawn. But this was no trivial matter. He jogged across the street toward her, trying to keep his composure despite the rising panic. "Karen!" he called out, his voice louder than he intended. Karen turned, raising an eyebrow as if annoyed by the interruption. She was dressed in her usual evening walk attire, a tracksuit that looked more expensive than practical and pristine white sneakers that showed no signs of wear. Her dog, a small white Pomeranian named Princess, yapped at Michael as he approached. "Michael," Karen said, her tone exasperated. "What's the matter? You're being very loud." "That's your car in my driveway, isn't it?" Michael said, pointing toward the SUV. Karen glanced over her shoulder, her expression indifferent. "Yes, that's mine. Why?" Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Karen, I've got an emergency. My daughter is upstairs struggling to breathe. I just called 911 and an ambulance is on its way. They need access to my driveway. You have to move your car, now." Karen tilted her head, her expression unimpressed. "Oh, come on, Michael. It's just a driveway. The ambulance can park on the street like everyone else. Why are you making such a big deal about this?" Michael felt his blood pressure spike. "Because every second counts, Karen. My daughter is having trouble breathing, and the paramedics need to get to her as quickly as possible. Your car is blocking the driveway, and it's going to delay them." Karen rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic sigh. "Fine, fine, I'll move it," she said, but she didn't make any effort to head toward the SUV. Instead, she bent down to adjust Princess's leash and continued walking slowly toward her house. Michael clenched his fists, fighting the urge to yell. "Karen, please, this is serious." She glanced back over her shoulder, her tone condescending. "Michael, you're overreacting. The ambulance isn't even here yet. Relax. I'll move it in." Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw that the ambulance was now just 2 minutes away, according to the GPS tracker the dispatcher had sent him. His heart raced as he turned back to Karen. "You don't have a minute. The ambulance is almost here," he shouted. Karen stopped walking and looked at him as if he were being unreasonable. "Michael, you need to calm down. Stressing out like this isn't going to help anyone." Michael felt a surge of anger and desperation. He didn't have time to argue. Without another word, he turned and ran back to his house. He needed to figure out another solution, and fast. As he stood on the porch, scanning the street for the approaching ambulance, his mind raced. Should he try to push Karen's car out of the way himself? Should he call the police? But before he could decide, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. The ambulance came into view, its flashing lights illuminating the quiet suburban street. Michael waved frantically to get the paramedics' attention, pointing toward his house and then to the driveway. The paramedics slowed as they approached, clearly confused by the presence of the SUV blocking their path. One of the paramedics stepped out, a tall man in his late 30s, and approached Michael. "Sir, is this your car?" he asked, gesturing to the SUV. "No, it's not mine," Michael said quickly. "It's my neighbor's. I told her to move it, but she's taking her sweet time. Please, can you just help my daughter? She's upstairs, struggling to breathe." The paramedic nodded, his expression serious. "We'll get to her as quickly as we can, but this is going to slow us down." Michael watched as the paramedics grabbed their equipment and began unloading a stretcher from the back of the ambulance. Instead of being able to pull into the driveway and enter through the front door, they were forced to park on the street and carry everything up the driveway on foot. Michael's frustration boiled over as he glanced across the street and saw Karen still strolling leisurely with her dog, completely unbothered. As the paramedics worked their way up the driveway with the stretcher and medical equipment, Michael's anxiety continued to rise. He ran back into the house to guide them to Emily, his heart pounding with fear for his daughter and anger at the absurdity of the situation. The paramedics entered the house swiftly, their professionalism a sharp contrast to the chaos Michael felt inside. One of them, a woman with a calm demeanor and steady hands, crouched beside Emily and began assessing her condition. She asked Michael a series of questions: when Emily's symptoms began, if she had any allergies, and if she had ever experienced something like this before. Michael did his best to answer, though his voice trembled with worry. Meanwhile, outside, the SUV remained an infuriating obstacle. Karen, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, had finally returned to her front yard. She stood there, casually chatting with another neighbor as if nothing was amiss. Michael could see her through the window, gesturing animatedly while Princess pranced around her feet. His frustration boiled over. Once he was certain the paramedics were tending to Emily, Michael stormed outside to confront Karen again. His footsteps were heavy and his voice was louder than he intended when he called out, "Karen, are you seriously just standing there while my daughter's life is in danger?" Karen turned to face him, her expression a mix of annoyance and faux concern. "Michael, I already said I'd move my car," she replied with an exaggerated sigh. "But I didn't see the need to rush. The ambulance is already here, isn't it?" Michael clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. "They're here, but they had to park on the street and carry everything up the driveway because your car is blocking the way. Do you even realize how much time you've wasted?" Karen shrugged, crossing her arms defensively. "Oh, come on. It's not like an extra minute or two is going to make a difference. And let's not forget, this is a public emergency service. They're used to dealing with things like this." "You're being dramatic." Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. "This isn't about being dramatic, Karen. This is about my daughter struggling to breathe upstairs while you stand here acting like it's no big deal." Karen rolled her eyes and waved a hand dismissively. "Look, I didn't park there to inconvenience you. My spot in front of my house was taken by someone else. I had no choice but to use your driveway temporarily. It's not like I was planning to leave it there forever." Michael's voice grew louder, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "It doesn't matter why you parked there. What matters is that you refused to move it when I told you there was an emergency. Do you even understand how selfish that is?" Karen raised an eyebrow, her tone becoming more defensive. "Selfish? Oh, please. Don't act like I'm some kind of monster, Michael. I had no way of knowing your daughter was sick when I parked there, and let's be honest, your driveway is empty most of the time anyway. I didn't think it would be a big deal." Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew this conversation wasn't going anywhere productive, but he couldn't let her blatant disregard for the situation go unchallenged. "Karen, it's not about whether my driveway is empty or not. It's about common decency and respect. You knew there was an emergency, and you still chose to prioritize your own convenience over someone else's safety." Karen's face flushed with irritation. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. I'm not the villain here, Michael. Maybe you should have been more organized. If you knew your daughter had health issues, you should have planned for emergencies like this, instead of blaming me for a minor inconvenience." Michael felt a surge of anger, but before he could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. It was one of the paramedics, the tall man who had spoken to Michael earlier. He had stepped outside to retrieve additional equipment and overheard the heated exchange. "Excuse me," the paramedic said firmly, his tone professional but unmistakably sharp. "Are you the owner of the vehicle blocking the driveway?" Karen straightened her posture, clearly taken aback by the paramedic's directness. "Yes, that's my car, but I was just about to move it." The paramedic crossed his arms, his expression stern. "I need you to move it immediately. Your car is not only obstructing access for emergency personnel, but it's also creating a safety hazard. We need to ensure we can exit quickly if the situation escalates." Karen hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her options. Then, with an exaggerated huff, she pulled a set of keys from her pocket. "Fine. If it's such a big deal, I'll move it now," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Michael watched as Karen strolled leisurely to her SUV, taking her time unlocking the door and starting the engine. The paramedic gave her a pointed look but said nothing more, clearly focused on getting back to Emily as quickly as possible. As Karen backed out of the driveway, she rolled down her window and called out, "Happy now? I hope you realize this whole thing could have been avoided if you'd just stayed calm, Michael." Michael didn't respond. He was too consumed with worry for Emily to waste any more energy arguing with her. Instead, he turned to the paramedic. "Thank you," he said, his voice tight with emotion. The paramedic nodded. "Let's focus on your daughter. We'll do everything we can to help her." As the SUV finally pulled away, Michael felt a brief moment of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the gravity of the situation inside. He followed the paramedic back into the house, silently vowing to hold Karen accountable for her actions once Emily was safe. Inside the house, the paramedics were doing everything they could to stabilize Emily. Michael stood nearby, wringing his hands and watching helplessly as they worked. They administered oxygen through a mask, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. One paramedic spoke soothingly to Emily while the other adjusted the equipment, ensuring the flow of oxygen was steady. Michael's mind was a storm of emotions. He was terrified for Emily, angry at Karen's blatant disregard for the situation, and overwhelmed by the helplessness of not being able to fix this himself. He kept glancing at the clock on the wall, each second feeling like an eternity. Every delay, no matter how small, felt like a personal failure, even though he knew he had done everything in his power to help his daughter. When the paramedics finally got Emily stable enough to move, one of them turned to Michael. "We're taking her to the hospital now. She's stable for the moment, but we need to run tests to find out what's causing her breathing issues." Michael nodded quickly. "I'll follow you in my car." The paramedic placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, we'll take good care of her. Just drive safely, okay?" As the paramedics wheeled Emily out of the house on the stretcher, Michael couldn't help but think about how much smoother this process could have been if not for Karen's interference. The memory of her smug expression and dismissive tone burned in his mind, fueling his frustration. He pushed the thoughts aside for now. Emily's well-being was his priority. Outside, the SUV was gone, and the driveway was finally clear. The ambulance pulled in close to the house, allowing the paramedics to load Emily inside with greater ease. Michael watched as they secured her stretcher and shut the doors before the vehicle sped off, sirens wailing. As soon as the ambulance disappeared down the street, Michael felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. Her actions had caused unnecessary delays during a critical medical emergency, and she had shown no remorse for her behavior. This wasn't just about him or Emily. What if it happened to someone else in the neighborhood? What if Karen's selfishness endangered another family's life? Michael decided to take action. He returned to the house briefly to grab his phone, then stepped back outside. His first call was to the local police department. He explained the situation in detail, emphasizing how Karen's car had obstructed access for emergency personnel during a life-threatening medical crisis. The officer on the other end of the line listened carefully and assured Michael that they would send someone to investigate. Michael thanked them and hung up, feeling a small sense of relief. But he wasn't done yet. Next, he sent an email to the Homeowners Association, Primus Communal Association. Karen's actions clearly violated several community rules, including the prohibition against parking in other residents' driveways without permission. Michael outlined the incident in meticulous detail, attaching photos he had taken earlier of Karen's SUV parked in his driveway and the ambulance struggling to navigate around it. He demanded that the homeowner association take disciplinary action against Karen, arguing that her behavior was not only disrespectful, but also dangerous. Feeling slightly more in control, Michael took a moment to collect himself before heading to the hospital to check on Emily. The drive was a blur, his mind racing with worry and anger. When he arrived at the emergency room, he found Emily resting in a hospital bed, her cheeks regaining a bit of their usual color. The sight brought him a wave of relief, though he knew they still had a long road ahead. The next morning, Michael woke up to a flurry of notifications on his phone. The neighborhood's group chat was buzzing with activity. Apparently, news of the incident had spread quickly, and many neighbors were outraged by Karen's behavior. Some shared their own stories of her entitlement. Complaints about her dog trespassing on their lawns, her constant passive-aggressive notes about minor infractions, and her habit of parking wherever she pleased. One neighbor, Megan, had taken it upon herself to post about the incident on social media, framing it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of selfishness and lack of empathy. The post quickly gained traction, with hundreds of likes, comments, and shares. People from outside the neighborhood chimed in, expressing their disbelief and anger at Karen's actions. By mid-morning, Michael received a call from the Homeowner Association president, Mr. Fritz. His voice was grave as he addressed the situation. "Michael, I want to start by saying how sorry I am for what happened to your daughter," Mr. Fritz began. "We've received your email, and several other residents have contacted us about this incident as well. This is completely unacceptable, and we're taking it very seriously." Michael thanked him but made it clear that he expected real consequences for Karen. "This isn't just about me or my family. What she did put lives at risk. She needs to be held accountable." Mr. Fritz assured him that the Homeowner Association would review the incident and take appropriate action. Karen has already been notified that a formal complaint has been filed against her. We'll be holding a hearing to determine the consequences. I'll keep you updated on our progress. Michael felt a small sense of vindication, but he knew this was only the beginning. He spent the rest of the day at the hospital, staying by Emily's side as the doctors ran tests to determine what had caused her sudden breathing problems. The results revealed that she had a severe allergic reaction, likely triggered by something she had unknowingly ingested. The doctors prescribed medication and advised Michael to keep an epinephrine auto-injector on hand at all times. By the time they returned home, Michael was physically and emotionally exhausted. But as he pulled into his driveway, he noticed something unusual. Karen's SUV was parked neatly in her own driveway for once, and she was nowhere to be seen. It seemed she was keeping a low profile after the backlash from the neighborhood. The following week, the Homeowner Association held a meeting to address the incident. Michael attended, along with several other neighbors who had grown tired of Karen's antics. Karen herself showed up, though she avoided eye contact with anyone and sat quietly in the corner. During the meeting, Mr. Fritz outlined the details of the incident and read statements from Michael and the paramedics. Karen was given an opportunity to defend herself, but her excuses only angered the other residents further. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," she said, her voice defensive. "I just didn't think it was that serious, and honestly, Michael made such a big deal out of nothing. The ambulance got there, didn't it?" Her lack of remorse was the final straw for many in the room. The homeowner association voted unanimously to fine Karen for violating community rules and ordered her to issue a formal apology to Michael and his family. They also warned her that any future incidents would result in more severe consequences, including potential legal action. As the meeting adjourned, Michael felt a sense of closure. While he knew nothing could erase the stress and fear of that night, he was relieved that Karen was finally being held accountable for her actions. Most importantly, Emily was on the road to recovery, and their community had come together to support them during a difficult time. In the days following the homeowner association meeting, Michael hoped the incident would fade into the background, allowing him and Emily to move on. Emily's health was improving, and the hospital had assured Michael that with the right precautions, her allergies could be managed. Still, the memory of that night lingered like a shadow in his mind, a reminder of how one person's selfishness could jeopardize another's safety. Karen, however, was far from letting the situation go. Instead of acknowledging her mistake and moving on, she doubled down. She began complaining to anyone who would listen that she was being unfairly targeted by the homeowner association and the neighborhood. In her version of events, Michael had exaggerated the emergency, and the homeowner association had overreacted by imposing fines and demanding an apology. Michael heard about Karen's complaints through the neighborhood grapevine. Several neighbors stopped by to show their support, assuring Michael that they were on his side. Despite their reassurances, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's behavior was far from over. He wasn't wrong. A few days later, Michael received an official-looking envelope in the mail. He opened it to find a letter from Karen's attorney. The letter accused Michael of defamation and harassment, claiming that his complaints to the homeowner association and his involvement in spreading the story on social media had damaged Karen's reputation. The letter demanded that Michael retract his statements, issue a public apology, and pay for Karen's emotional distress. Michael stared at the letter in disbelief. It felt surreal that Karen, the person who had obstructed access during a medical emergency, was now portraying herself as the victim. He immediately called his own attorney, a family friend named Jessica, to discuss the situation. Jessica read through the letter and shook her head. "This is nothing more than an intimidation tactic," she said. "Karen doesn't have a leg to stand on. You did nothing wrong. In fact, you were completely within your rights to report her to the homeowner association and share your story. If anything, she's the one who should be worried about legal consequences." Michael felt a small wave of relief at Jessica's words, but he couldn't ignore the underlying stress of being dragged into a legal dispute. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We respond," Jessica said firmly. "I'll draft a letter outlining the facts of the situation and make it clear that her claims are baseless. If she wants to pursue this further, we'll be ready." Over the next week, the tension in the neighborhood grew. Karen continued to spread her version of events, painting herself as the victim of a smear campaign. She went so far as to organize a small meeting with a handful of like-minded neighbors who were sympathetic to her plight. However, the majority of the community sided with Michael, recognizing Karen's actions for what they were: selfish and irresponsible. Meanwhile, Jessica's response letter arrived at Karen's attorney's office. The letter was direct and detailed, laying out the timeline of events and emphasizing that Michael had acted within his rights to report Karen's behavior. Jessica also included statements from the paramedics and the homeowner association, which further validated Michael's account of the incident. Karen's attorney responded with a request for mediation, likely realizing that their case wouldn't hold up in court. Jessica advised Michael to agree to the mediation, as it could provide an opportunity to resolve the issue without further escalation. The mediation session was scheduled at a local law office. Michael arrived early, accompanied by Jessica, while Karen showed up with her attorney in an air of indignation. She avoided eye contact with Michael, instead scrolling through her phone as if the whole thing was a waste of her time. The mediator, a neutral third party, began the session by outlining the purpose of mediation: to reach a mutually agreeable resolution without the need for litigation. She then invited both parties to share their perspectives. Michael spoke first, recounting the events of that night in detail. He described the fear and urgency he felt as Emily struggled to breathe, the frustration of finding Karen's SUV blocking the driveway, and the additional delays caused by her refusal to move the car. He emphasized that his actions were not personal, but were taken out of concern for his daughter's safety. When it was Karen's turn to speak, her tone was defensive and dismissive. She claimed that she hadn't realized the severity of the situation and accused Michael of blowing things out of proportion. She also reiterated her complaints about being unfairly targeted by the homeowner association and the neighborhood. The mediator listened patiently before addressing both parties. "It's clear that this situation has caused significant tension in your community," she said. "While I understand that emotions are running high, I believe there is an opportunity here to resolve this amicably." She proposed a resolution. Karen would issue a formal apology to Michael and agree to comply with all homeowner association rules moving forward. In exchange, Michael would agree not to pursue any further action against her. Both parties would also refrain from discussing the incident publicly. Michael hesitated. On one hand, he wanted to put the ordeal behind him and focus on Emily's recovery. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the principle of the matter. Karen's actions had put his daughter's life at risk, and her refusal to take responsibility only added insult to injury. He turned to Jessica, who gave him a small nod, silently encouraging him to do what felt right. After a moment of deliberation, Michael agreed to the mediator's proposal. "I'll accept this resolution, but only if Karen truly commits to changing her behavior. This isn't just about me. It's about the safety and well-being of everyone in our community." Karen, visibly annoyed, begrudgingly agreed. "Fine, if that's what it takes to move on, I'll do it," she said, though her tone lacked sincerity. The mediator finalized the agreement and both parties signed the document. As they left the mediation session, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's apology, if it came at all, would be more about fulfilling the terms of the agreement than genuine remorse. Still, he took comfort in knowing that he had done everything he could to stand up for his family and his community. In the days that followed, Karen issued a brief written apology to Michael and the homeowner association. It was perfunctory at best, but it marked the end of the legal dispute. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though Karen remained a polarizing figure. Michael, meanwhile, focused on moving forward. He installed additional security cameras around his property, ensuring that any future incidents would be well documented. He also became more active in the homeowner association, working with other residents to promote a sense of accountability and community. Though the experience had been exhausting, Michael felt a sense of pride in standing up for what was right. Most importantly, Emily was safe and healthy, and their bond as father and daughter had only grown stronger in the face of adversity. The days after the mediation felt quieter, but the events of that night still loomed large in Michael's mind. Emily was recovering well, her energy slowly returning as the medications prescribed by her doctor began to manage her condition effectively. Yet for Michael, the thought of how close they had come to disaster lingered, a nagging reminder of just how fragile life could be. He had done everything right in that moment, acted quickly, called for help, stayed calm, and yet Karen's selfishness had almost undone it all. The apology Karen sent, a brief and emotionless letter written more out of obligation than remorse, hadn't done much to ease the tension. Michael could see through its shallow wording, and he knew the rest of the neighborhood could too. Karen had returned to her routine, walking her dog in the evenings and waving to a few neighbors who still tolerated her. But the once unwritten social tolerance for her antics had eroded completely. Where once she could wield her entitlement with impunity, she now found herself isolated. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the mediation, Michael was working in his home office when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone, so he glanced out the window before heading to the door. To his surprise, it was Megan, one of his more outspoken neighbors and the person who had initially posted about Karen's actions on social media. Hey, Michael, she began, holding a small envelope in her hand. Sorry to drop by unannounced, but I thought you might want to see this. Michael invited her inside, gesturing toward the kitchen table. Megan handed him the envelope, which contained a photocopy of a letter. As Michael read it, his brow furrowed. The letter was from Karen, addressed to the homeowner association, and it detailed her grievances about how she felt she had been treated unfairly. She accused Michael of exaggerating the incident, claimed that the community was conspiring against her, and demanded that her fines and penalties be rescinded. I thought you'd want to know she's trying to stir things up again, Megan said, watching his reaction carefully. A few of us got copies of this letter, too. She's trying to rally support, but honestly, no one's buying it. Michael sighed, setting the letter down. It's like she can't let it go. She refuses to take responsibility, even after everything that's happened. Megan nodded. I know, but here's the thing. This neighborhood has your back. After what you and Emily went through, no one's going to side with her on this. I just wanted to make sure you weren't blindsided if she starts stirring up trouble again. Michael thanked Megan for her support, feeling a mix of frustration and gratitude. While Karen's persistence was exhausting, the solidarity of the community reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. In the weeks that followed, Karen's attempts to reclaim her standing in the neighborhood fell flat. The homeowner association stood firm in their decision, refusing to rescind her fines or overturn the formal warning on her record. Most neighbors ignored her entirely, tired of her drama and unwilling to be drawn into her orbit of entitlement. Michael, meanwhile, found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. The incident with Karen had exposed weaknesses in the way the neighborhood handled conflicts and emergencies. The homeowner association's rules were clear, but enforcement had often been lax, allowing people like Karen to push boundaries without consequence. Michael saw an opportunity to turn this ordeal into something positive. At the next homeowner association meeting, Michael proposed several new measures to improve the community. These included stricter enforcement of parking rules, clearer guidelines for handling emergencies, and the creation of a neighborhood emergency response plan. His proposals were met with enthusiasm, and many neighbors volunteered to help implement the changes. Karen, notably absent from the meeting, remained a topic of quiet conversation. While some speculated that she might move away to escape the fallout, others believed she would stay, unwilling to admit defeat. For Michael, it didn't matter. His focus was on creating a safer, more supportive community for Emily and everyone else. One evening, as Michael was tucking Emily into bed, she looked up at him with her big, curious eyes. "Dad," she said softly, "why was that lady so mean to us?" Michael hesitated, searching for the right words. He didn't want to burden Emily with the complexities of adult conflicts, but he also wanted to teach her something meaningful. Sometimes people think about themselves more than others, he explained gently. They forget that their actions can hurt people, even if they don't mean to. But the important thing is that we stayed strong and did what we needed to do to keep you safe. Emily nodded, her small hand reaching out to hold his. "I'm glad you're my dad." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride and love. "And I'm glad you're my daughter. You're the most important thing in the world to me." As he turned off the light and closed her door, Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in weeks. The storm had passed, and while the scars of that night would remain, they were a reminder of his strength, his love for Emily, and the importance of standing up for what was right. The months that followed saw a noticeable shift in the neighborhood. The new emergency response plan was implemented, and the homeowner association took a more active role in ensuring the community's rules were followed. Michael became a trusted voice in the neighborhood, known not just for his advocacy, but for his kindness and willingness to help others. Karen, on the other hand, faded into the background. Her attempts to regain her influence failed, and she eventually put her house on the market. By the time the for sale sign went up in her yard, it was clear that she had lost whatever hold she once had over the community. One sunny afternoon, as Michael and Emily played catch in the front yard, a moving truck pulled up to Karen's house. Michael watched as she emerged, directing the movers with her usual air of superiority. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Karen looked away quickly, her expression unreadable. Emily noticed the exchange and tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Is she leaving?" she asked. Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, it looks like she is." "Good," Emily said with a grin. "Maybe the new neighbors will be nice." Michael chuckled, ruffling her hair. "I think you're right, kiddo." As the moving truck pulled away, Michael felt a sense of closure. The ordeal with Karen had been one of the most challenging experiences of his life, but it had also brought him closer to his daughter and his community. In the end, it wasn't just about one person's selfishness. It was about resilience, accountability, and the power of standing together. With the sun setting behind them, Michael and Emily continued their game of catch, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. The future felt brighter, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt truly at peace.